PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about books on Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Sheilah Vance, the author of Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulph Mills Encampment.
This week on PA Books, Sheilah Vance, author of Threshold to Valley Forge.
Sheilah Vance is the author of Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulph Mills Encampment. Sheilah, what drew you to the story of these 6 days?
Well, thank you, Phil. I was born in Gulph Mills on a street, on a hill called Rebel Hill. And as I was growing up, one of the landmarks in Gulph Mills, and actually it is the landmark in the National Register of Historic Places that is the symbol of the Gulph Mills Encampment, is called the Hanging Rock. And it's on Gulph Road at the bottom of Rebel Hill. And it's a rock that juts out into the road, very substantially into the road. And when I was growing up there, cars and trucks would have to stop and try to maneuver around the hanging rock, and a lot of times unsuccessfully. And over time, Pennsylvania Department of Transportation wanted to cut back the rock. And the community objected because the rock was actually owned by, I think then it was called the Friends of Valley Forge National Historic Park, as the symbol of the Gulph Mills Encampment, saying that when George Washington and his army encamped in Gulph Mills and marched to Valley Forge, they marched past the rock. So there was always a lot of controversy about PennDOT trying to cut back the rock or get rid of it altogether. And so my mother said, Hanging Rock is famous because George Washington and his army were here on Rebel Hill. And the only reason they moved to Valley Forge is because they wanted to get further away from Philadelphia. So Hanging Rock was famous my entire childhood on Gulph Mills. And then I just developed an interest in history over my time living in Pennsylvania. And it seemed like everywhere I lived had a connection to the Revolutionary War, but the one that meant the most to me was what happened on Rebel Hill and in Gulph Mills.
Now, this encampment, these 6 days, took place in mid-December of 1777. What had been going on prior to that led up to this encampment at Gulph Mills?
Yes. It was a very important time, and I call the Gulph Mills Encampment a pivotal microcosm of the Revolutionary War because many things happened right before the Gulph Mills Encampment that there were a lot of questions as to where the new country was going, the new United States, how the Continental Army was going to make it, essentially, because the Army had, the soldiers had little food, little clothing, whatever shelter they could get as they moved around. And there was, back in those days, armies didn't fight in the winter because they couldn't move their cannons, big cannons. There was no paved roads like there are today. The roads were muddy and jutted, and they couldn't move easily at the time. So there was a lot of question. George Washington and the Continental Army had just spent 6 weeks in White Marsh, where they retreated after the Battle of Germantown, October 4th. In 1777. So they were in White Marsh for 6 weeks. And Washington had even surveyed his generals about whether they thought they should engage in one more battle with the British before they went into winter quarters and were essentially quiet for the winter. And also, where should they go for winter quarters? So when he surveyed his generals, most of them said, absolutely not. Our army is in no shape to engage with the British one more time. And they gave various opinions about where they should go for winter quarters, but they all wanted to get further away from the British. But the British General William Howe, who was in charge of the British Continental Army, the British Army in Philadelphia, that was his formal name, which had taken Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, with no shots fired. But the British Army decided, we're going to engage in one more battle before we go into our winter quarters, and we're going into our winter quarters in Philadelphia because there was housing and it was much more comfortable. So on December 4th, General Howe marched out most of the 20,000 soldiers who were in Philadelphia to Washington. Thought it was going to be a full-scale attack on the Continental Army, which numbered about 11,000 at the time. So he was ready, but for about 2 or 3 days, General Howe and the Continental Army, they skirmished around the edges of the White Marsh encampment, and really about at least 100 soldiers lost their lives. But General Howe never engaged in the full-on assault against the Continental Army that everyone was thinking was going to happen. On December 8th, he withdrew and went back to Philadelphia. But not just the Continental Army was at that encampment in Gulph Mills. The Continental Congress was very concerned about how the war was progressing, and was Washington the right person to lead the Continental Army? General Horatio Gates, with the northern part of the Continental Army, had just scored a wonderful victory at Saratoga in New York, also in October 1777. So many people were thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe General Gates should be leading the Continental Army. So the Continental Congress, which was in exile in York, Pennsylvania, when the British came into Philadelphia, they moved to York, which was about, about 100 miles away from Philadelphia. So the Continental Army said, well, we're going to send a committee down to Washington's camp to see what's really going on, and what is Washington going to engage in another battle before he goes into winter quarters, and where are they going to go? And again, is he the person to lead this army? So all of that was going on at the time. And there were, I think, 4 members of the committee, and they actually, I guess, I'm not going to say luck would have it, but they were there when the British started the Battle of Matson's Fort. So they were able to see firsthand how the Continental Army was, what kind of shape it was in, what kind of fighting shape it was in. And they concluded it wasn't in good battle shape, and what kind of leader Washington was. And so they concluded, all right, he's the person, at least for now, he's fine to lead the army. So that was going on at the same time, right before the Gulph Mills encampment. At the same time, the people of Pennsylvania and the government of Pennsylvania had the war right there in their backyards. So the British were in Philadelphia, the Continental Army was out in White Marsh, not even 10, 13 miles down the road. And so the Pennsylvania, at the time, it was called the Pennsylvania General Assembly and Supreme Executive Council, which was led by Thomas Wharton. They were very concerned about, whoa, the Army's going to be here for the winter, we think, but what are they going to do? Are they going to leave the residents of Pennsylvania to the depredations of the British? Like, is there going to be no one here to protect the residents of Pennsylvania all winter long? But if the Army is here, as we'd like them to stay somewhere in the surrounding area, then are they going to look to us, the Pennsylvania General Assembly, to support them? Because they knew, because they had a lot of correspondence flying back and forth between the Pennsylvania generals and the Pennsylvania General Assembly and the residents. Are they going to look to us to support the whole Continental Army? They're like, we don't have the money to do that. We'll support the Pennsylvania troops, but, our militia at least. So that was another thing that was going on before the Gulph Mills encampment. At the same time, Ben Franklin, who was Pennsylvania's most famous citizen because of his experiments with electricity and other scientific experiments, he had been sent to France sometime earlier in 1777. It might have even been late 76, but he had been sent to France to serve as an envoy. It was a committee of the Continental Congress called the Committee of Foreign Affairs or Committee of Secret Correspondence, but they were basically called the American Commissioners. It was him and two other gentlemen, Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, were sent to France to try to get formal support from the French government for the Revolutionary War because, France and England were bitter enemies, and also to get support from other European nations for the Revolutionary War. So Franklin and his commissioners were over in France trying to do that. France was supporting the Revolutionary War in a kind of stealth manner by still shipping arms, money, even clothing to clothe the troops, as they could. But King Louis the 16th had not decided to formally, officially, diplomatically support the Continental Army. So a lot of things were up in the air as Washington's army was in White Marsh right before they crossed over into Gulph Mills.
Now I want to go back to just before the Battle of White Marsh. Washington was warned that Howe was on the move. How did he get that information?
Yes, he got it through a couple sources. One was there was a woman who lived in Center City, Philadelphia, and her home was used sometimes as a meeting place by General Howe with his officers. And so she overheard them saying that they were going to move out and attack Washington and the Continental Army. So she devised some kind of message and kind of hid it in a, what did they call it? A needle case that had sewing needles in it, maybe knitting needles, I don't know exactly. But she was able to get that message to someone who was close to Washington, who was close to the Continental Army. His name is Elias Boudinot. He might have even been in the Continental Army, but she was able to get a message to him, and she knew him from being in Philadelphia, who was almost like a neighbor. And so then when he opened up the needle case, he saw that there was this message, and so he got that message to Washington that General Howe was planning an attack. And then at least a few other people who were in Philadelphia, because again, these were average everyday citizens who were in Philadelphia, just living there as the British Army went about their business. And so there were spies. So they would tell, the members of the Continental Army, those who supported the Revolutionary War, what was going on. So a few people also warned Washington. So he was ready. He was ready when General Howe came out.
Now, you also mentioned the committee that the Continental Congress had sent out to the camp to observe. Were they concerned? There have been several battles where Washington at Brandywine and Paoli, where there were defeats. Were they concerned about Washington's command abilities?
Absolutely, they were. Because the Philadelphia campaign did not go well for Washington and the Continental Army. Yes, the Battle of Brandywine, September 11th, 1777, was basically considered a loss for the Continental Army, and that was considered to be the beginning of the Philadelphia campaign. And then the Battle of Paoli, or what is known also as the Paoli Massacre, occurred right before the British, I think it was September 20th, but right before the British marched into Philadelphia. And so that was a great loss. And Pennsylvania's own General Anthony Wayne was involved in that. Those are really his troops that were massacred that night. And then in Germantown, October 4th, the Battle of Germantown was really considered a draw. Some people considered it a loss, but it was a foggy day, and some people reported, the American troops were shooting at each other because they really couldn't see. So there was really no great victory during that time, from September up until December. At the same time, as I said, you had Horatio Gates in the Northern Army in New York and Saratoga that captured British General Burgoyne and 5,000 of his soldiers. So people were celebrating that all over the 13 states now. So there was a lot of concern whether Washington was the right person. And again, a lot of correspondence, messages were going back and forth between the camps, and even some soldiers who had fought with General Gates at Saratoga had made their way down to where Washington was, and many of them thought Gates was the better commander.
So after a period of time at White Marsh, George Washington decides to move to Gulph Mills. What was it about Gulph Mills that he thought would be a good place for an encampment?
Yes. Well, it's unclear whether he really thought how long he was going to stay in Gulph Mills. Some people say they thought he was going to make his winter quarters there. Others say no, he had already made the decision to go to Valley Forge when he was at White Marsh, and Gulph Mills was just a pass-through. But no one knows for sure when he made the decision to go to Valley Forge. So what happened was, after the Battle of White Marsh, even though General Howe did not fully engage the entire Continental Army, which was ready, they were ready for the fight, Washington said, I have to move the army further away from Philadelphia. And again, he had surveyed his officers about where they should go for winter quarters. Should it be someplace close to Philadelphia? Should it be in New Jersey, or even as far away as Delaware? So, but it's clear Washington's desire was to get further away from the British, and really to put the Schuylkill River between the Continental Army and the British. So on December 10th, he had his officer generals draw up an order of march from White Marsh to Gulph Mills. And Gulph Mills was a very strategic location because it had a lot of high hills. Like I said, Rebel Hill was the highest point in Gulf Mills. It was like a 2-mile hill at the time. It's broken up now because of the highways, but it was 2 miles that ran from the Hanging Rock, which was called the Gulf Creek there, all the way down to the Schuylkill River. And from the top of Rebel Hill, you could see Philadelphia. So you could see everything around you. So it was very strategic in that regard. So Washington decided that he was going to have the army cross at Madson's Ford, which is present-day Conshohocken on one side, West Conshohocken on the other side, in Upper Marion Township and in Plymouth Township. So Washington got the army together. He had the order of march. He sent Pennsylvania's Brigadier General James Potter down closer to where Philadelphia today would meet West Philadelphia, or around Lower Marion, to serve as an advance guard, make sure the British weren't coming up that way, or he could warn Washington. So Washington had General James Sullivan from Maryland, or was it New Hampshire? I can't recall exactly, but General James Sullivan, John Sullivan, who was James Potter, was the Pennsylvania general, but General John Sullivan led a number of regiments across a bridge they had built at Madson's Ford, which was a low point in the river. But the bridge was basically, it was all rickety. It was just made up of wagons and wood and things. So they could get these big cannons across, their horses across and everything. So on the morning of December 11th, down where General Potter was, closer to Philadelphia, he had like 3 pickets. One was down there, one was in Lower Marion, and one was at the Black Horse Tavern in Lower Marion, and the other was at Harriton Plantation in Lower Marion, closer to Rebel Hill, only a few miles away. But anyway, there were a couple of hundred men stationed down with the first picket closest to Philadelphia, and they saw several thousand British soldiers coming out of Philadelphia. So they sent a rider to General Potter, who was at the Black Horse Inn. No, he was at Harriton Plantation, to warn him, and he sent a rider down to Madson's Ford to warn the Continental Army, or General Sullivan, as they were coming across. So at the same time, by the time Potter was able to warn General Sullivan, 800 men had already crossed over at Matson's Ford. And so when they crossed over, they saw high up on Rebel Hill another couple thousand British, and literally on the hill, because you could just see them lined up. And that's how high the hill was. And as soon as you came up, it's like, oh my gosh, they just came up the backside and they were there. So General Sullivan was not sure whether whether General Howe had decided he was going to bring the entire British Army out to attack the Continental Army one more time, because he knew where they were. So he wasn't sure whether the entire, what am I getting into, whether the entire army was there. So he had the 800 cross back across Matson's Ford and destroy the bridge behind them. At the same time, General Potter, the British on the other end of Philadelphia County, because at that time, Gulph Mills was also in Philadelphia County. So you had the British coming at them, the Continental forces from both sides of Philadelphia County. So at the same time, General Potter kept retreating back and back every time the British came, because he only had maybe at the most 600 men, and there were several thousand British soldiers. So they engaged in a battle called the Battle of Matson's Ford. And they engaged in that battle all the way from, again, like I said, one end of Philadelphia all the way up to Rebel Hill. And it was mostly Pennsylvania militia that was a part of that battle. But Gulph Mills itself, again, it was a very strategic location, which Washington, for whatever reasons he had, wanted the army to be there, at least for a while. Again, how long a while, we don't know. Whether he wanted them there all winter would have made sense because of the strategic location, or whether he had already decided we're going to Valley Forge, but the army doesn't need to march straight there. So Washington moved the Continental Army. After he consulted with his generals, after he had sent out some other soldiers on reconnaissance to say, look, is this the whole British Army? Like, are we getting into this again? He determined it was a very large foraging party. The soldiers had to forage for food, supplies, they're getting ready to go. The British are, they're going into winter quarters in Philadelphia, although Philadelphia had more support than, the surrounding areas. Still, they were, food was also scarce in the city, because you had the residents, you had 20,000 British soldiers kind of all vying for the same supplies. So anyway, Washington told the army, move a couple miles down the road to Swedes Ford, which is present day more like Norristown on one side and Bridgeport on the other, and cross at the Swedes Ford, which was another crossing place, but cross there the next day. So the army did so. They built another, rickety bridge out of carriages, etc., and then marched, excuse me, then marched down by what is now the River Road into Gulph Mills. And they didn't have any tents, so they had sent the tents on when they left White Marsh, because they didn't want them to get captured. And again, I don't think they really knew where they were going, so they just didn't have the tents. So, but strategically, Gulph Mills was a good place to be, and it had there were several mills there. The Gulph Mill, which was down the street from the Hanging Rock on Gulph Road, they could get flour. Some of these mills made not guns, but the word I'm looking for? What they call it, grape shot, that was used in the guns back at the time, like bullets. And then there were all kinds of mills, clothing mills also along the Gulf Creek. So Gulf Mills was a good place to be. And that's why I think he selected Gulf Mills. People say if he had already made up his mind to go to Valley Forge, he didn't have to start and stop at Gulf Mills. He could have kept going. When he crossed at Swedesford, they could have just crossed down Swedesford, which is like today's 202, Route 202, which goes straight into Valley Forge.
So once they arrive at Gulph Mills, you mentioned they don't have tents. So what do? Are they building some type of shelters for themselves?
Yes, they are. They had to build, they call them lean-tos. They had to cut down trees again, it was a heavily forested, wooded area, as most places were at that time. They had to cut down trees. They had to cut down, well, whatever evergreens or branches they could find to, support the trees, the shelter, the outlines that the wood they would make with the bark, and support themselves that way. And build fires, whatever fires they could build. You can imagine thousands of fires up on Rebel Hill. It's a big hill, and lit by thousands of fires at night. The officers generally would stay in people's homes if they could. So there were, residents in Gulph Mills. I do have some pictures in the book of one from the Radnor Historical Society that was taken in like the early 1900s, and that picture says possible headquarters of Washington's men. So we know we have two different houses that we think George Washington stayed in. No one knows for sure which one he used for his headquarters, but there are various clues. And then local residents, they just pass it down through the generations. Oh, Lafayette stayed here, and General Greene stayed here. On Rebel Hill right now, there's a house at the top of the hill where Lord Sterling, it was General William Alexander, but he went by the name Lord Sterling. He stayed in that house, and that's verifiable. So, yes, the soldiers were on their own to support themselves, to eat whatever they could find, whatever they could forage, and I try to use a lot of primary sources and documents in my book, journals from the soldiers, orderly books, letters about kind of what they experienced there, because I feel like all of this is best understood and best told in their own language. Like I'm a journalist before I became an attorney, so I consider myself a journalist historian. So I approach things like let people tell the story in their own words, and then but put it in context.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
So as you were reading these types of documents, was there anything that surprised you that the soldiers were writing about?
I would say, well, one of the most surprising things was that a lot of these documents still exist. Like you can go to places like the Library of Congress, Manuscript Room, or some of the historical societies, Pennsylvania Historical Society, and actually see the documents, hold them in your hands. So that was very surprising. But to me, it was, the one thing that really stood out from all of the soldiers' writings, the generals' writings that I came across was just the extreme personal sacrifices that they made to serve in the Continental Army, sacrifices their families made, and kind of how they lived. And I would say, if anything surprised me, I had heard about there was not a lot of food, but to really just read their stories of how we didn't eat that day, or we were lucky that we caught a beaver, say at the dam at the Gulf Creek that they built at the Gulf Creek, and that's what they had. That kind of moved me. That surprised me that they could go for at least a day, maybe longer, with no food, no provisions from the Army. Some regiments seemed to have provisions, but many did not, and they only ate what they could, as I say, eat what they could kill. So that was very surprising.
One of the elements of their diet was vinegar that you write about. Why were they given vinegar?
Well, vinegar is helped kill germs and infections. Like we have all kinds of medicines today, but vinegar was one thing that they gave to the soldiers to help kind of cleanse their systems and give them some nutrients that they weren't getting, because they knew they weren't, I guess the powers that be knew they weren't getting everything they needed from the food. And another thing that they usually got to kind of help cleanse their systems and was whiskey. They were supposed to be given a gill of whiskey every day, which they didn't get every day, and they were very happy when they got it. But that also served similar purposes. So yes.
During this time period, where you had both forces had foraging parties out, were they encountering each other? Were there small skirmishes during the period that they were at Gulph Mills?
Skirmishes, yes. Because the bulk of the army was on the hill, on Rebel Hill or in the surrounding Gulph Mills area, Washington still had to protect the army. So he always would send out like advance parties in the surrounding area. So as an example, one of the skirmishes I write about occurred in the area of Roxborough. I can't remember the exact name of the general or the officers who were involved, but it was a pretty a major skirmish where the British, again, because they're all here in the same area and they're all out here trying to get food and supplies from the same people. So there was a skirmish in the Roxborough area where the British really very brutally killed several residents, but they got into engagements with the soldiers that were sent out there. So that was happening all around the encampment, like the outer edges. And in my book, I talk about, again, some of the soldiers, right? Like today, we had 45 prisoners come in. We made 45 British prisoners. The British were, they attacked us at such and such, or this particular group that was out here. There were some soldiers who were stationed across the Schuylkill River, closer to the White Marsh encampment, closer to the British. So they would engage in skirmishes, yes, every now and then. Mm-hmm.
Now, you write about that there were several regiments from Rhode Island that included free African-American soldiers. Was that unusual at that time?
Well, at the time, in 1777, African Americans were not permitted to be official members, soldiers in the Continental Army. African Americans were allowed to be in the state militias that came in to fight with the Continental Army. Like every state had a militia that was usually more of an informal body that was formed to basically protect that state. But as the war went on, of course, these militias had to serve with the regulars in the Continental Army. And so many states had African Americans in their militias, free and enslaved. And many generals, Washington and many others had Potter, had their enslaved people with them, or one or two, a few, to kind of do what they did when they were back on their plantations to assist them. So, but in Rhode Island, that was Brigadier General James Varnum who commanded the Rhode Island regiments. So he had several free African Americans in his regiments, and I was very fortunate to meet a descendant of one of them at an event at the Society of Cincinnati here in Washington. She wrote a book about her descendants called Freeborn Men of Color, and about the Frank brothers. Those were her ancestors and their experience in the Rhode Island regiments. And then another friend of mine, and they were at Gulph Mills, and another friend of mine, Denise Dennis, I don't know if you have heard of her. She runs the Dennis Farm, in Pennsylvania. It's a wonderful tribute, really, to her family that has had soldiers free in the Continental Army from the Connecticut and I believe the New York lines. And so they were at Gulph Mills. And so, yes, there were free African Americans in the regiments, but the Continental Army did not allow African Americans to serve in it officially until 1778. I believe it was February, when General Varnum from Rhode Island was faced with having to fill the Rhode Island quota to the Continental Army. Every state had a quota. And he told Washington that he could not fill his quota with free white men. And Rhode Island then worked something out where they actually bought the freedom of enslaved people from their enslavers in Rhode Island, and had these men serve in the Continental Army. So that's kind of, so there were free and enslaved African Americans fighting the whole time, but through the state units.
Now, you also talk about the enslaved people who lived in Gulph Mills,
Yes.
and some of the people like Isaac Hughes, and in particular Richard Bevan, who you say was one of the most
Yeah.
notorious slaveholders. Who were these men? What made him so notorious?
Well, slavery was legal in all 13 states still in 1777. Pennsylvania was the first state to basically outlaw slavery in 1780. But in Gulph Mills, so you had people like Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Hughes, when they believe Washington, one of the places he might have stayed, with all probability, was at Isaac Hughes' farm, Walnut Grove Farm, in Gulph Mills, because these men they knew each other, before the war started, because they were merchants and they traded across the 13 colonies at the time. And so they did various, Hughes' father knew Washington. They all knew each other. So, and Hughes had a big estate in Pennsylvania, in Gulf Mills. So he had some enslaved people there. Richard Bevins was most of the people were farmers in the Gulf Mills area. So Richard Bevins was a farmer in the Gulf Mills area who had a number of enslaved people. And I think it was 2019, the King of Prussia Historical Society had a presentation. Its president, Dave Montalvo, did a fabulous presentation on slavery in Montgomery County. And he showed many of the runaway slave ads that he had found, and many of them mentioned Richard Bevins. And so his slaves were running away. And he obviously had a number of them. So that's why I included him in the book.
Now, another thing that was going on at Gulf Mills was Washington was initiating smallpox inoculation of some of the soldiers there. How significant was that a problem for them?
That was a big problem, because Washington, smallpox, now we have vaccines for all of these things, but back then, if you got it was very transmissible disease. I mean, if you got it, it spread like crazy. So Washington had told, I think I include something in the book where he had told one of his generals or officers, like, look, don't send us any soldiers unless they've had the smallpox. What they call a vaccine at the time was basically giving someone a little bit of the smallpox itself and letting that run, kind of like our vaccines do, run a mild course, and then that person could come and join the army. And again, at this time, they were trying to fill the army with men. The Revolutionary War had already was started 2 years ago, and people were coming in and out of their enlistments. And so some states would just recruit residents and send them on. But Washington said, don't send us any more soldiers or recruits unless they've had the vaccine, as they called it at the time, or they've had smallpox, because we don't want to have to do it here. Like, we don't have the time, the facilities to do that here. So that's what I was talking about.
Were local newspapers in this area covering the movements of these troops?
Yes. I include in the book some excerpts which I found online, and again at these historical societies or Library of Congress, from local newspapers. Now, the ones in Pennsylvania, like I think it's the Pennsylvania Gazette, might have been the major newspaper in Pennsylvania at the time. They would write about the troops now have moved across the Schuylkill. They're over the Schuylkill. We understand the troops are in the hills by the Gulf, or whatever. So they would report information. It wasn't as instantaneous as it is today. There's certainly a day's delay, a couple days delay. And then, so local newspapers were reporting on what the Continental Army was doing, what the British were doing. And then other newspapers around the 13 United States, they would be getting letters from, they would print letters from their soldiers about, where they were, what happened. And I also include several of them in the book as well. So yes, they tried to keep the Pennsylvania, and there were a lot of newspapers at the time, or broadsheets, or whatever they want to call them, but trying to get information to people, that was one main way to get information to people, was these printing presses. And in Philadelphia had a lot of them, and just kept going.
One of the things going on during this period was the Conway Cabal. What was that?
Yes. That was, again, we discussed a little earlier of how people were questioning Washington's leadership, whether he was a person to lead the Continental Army, especially when Gates had his victory. And an officer named George Conway, maybe I don't have the first name right, but anyway, one of the officers, last name Conway, was critical of Washington. And that information got out. It got back to Washington. It got to the Continental Congress. And Conway was like, look, this man should not be leading the Continental Army. I should have more of a leadership position as opposed to him. And so, but when the word got to Washington and his supporters, they kind of quashed that cabal. Basically, Washington kind of exiled Conway, like he didn't want to talk to him or communicate with him. But the Continental Congress said, oh, no, we think he's a good officer and he has a lot to offer. So sometime during these 6 days of the Gulph Mills Encampment, the Continental Congress made Conway the first Inspector General of the Continental Army, which was really like a slap in the face to Washington. So Washington accepted it. He had to accept it. But that was what that was all about, trying to really kind of overthrow Washington's command.
At what point are people like Benjamin Franklin and the American commissioners in France successful at getting the French to recognize the new United States?
Yes. Okay, so that occurred on December 17th. That was a monumental day for the Continental Army and for the whole American Revolution. That was the day Washington officially announced that he was moving the army to winter quarters. He didn't say it was going to be in Valley Forge. He said it was in the vicinity of this camp, which was Gulph Mills. He kept the exact location close to his vest, so the British didn't know, where to get out, and then they end up there or end up in Gulph Mills. But anyway, the American commissioners were over in France, and Ben Franklin and his group had been steadily working King Louis XVI and his officers to support the army and support the new United States. So on December 17th, Franklin and his commissioners got word from a very close, I'm not going to call him a staff person, but I'll say a minister of King Louis the 16th, that the king had decided, yes, he was going to diplomatically support the new United States and that the parties should start preparing a treaty of amity and commerce, like an official treaty, which they did. And they adopted it in February 1778. Word didn't get to Washington and them until May, where they had a great celebration. But at that time, Franklin, they had been constantly working, and the French had constantly supported the Continental Army by sending over French officers to serve in the Continental Army, like General Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, General de Kalb, who else came? Colonel Pulaski. He was from Poland, but he was serving with the French army. And General Louis Duportat, who was another French officer who came over, really through the efforts of Ben Franklin, because a lot of people wanted to come and fight with the Continental Army. Again, Britain was a bitter enemy, but they wanted to be a part of something new and special, like creating a republic and a democracy. So but they were successful on the 17th, and that's when that announcement. And I had the letter from that Ben Franklin wrote to the Continental Congress saying, "We did it. They're coming in officially." It's in the book.
Now, at the Gulph Mills Encampment, there were also a large number of women there, that often called camp followers. Who were they?
Yes, yes. There was the camp followers or the camp women were women who came with a lot of women came with their husbands to help them. Things weren't as formal as they are today, so the women could follow their husbands. And some of them also took on jobs like washing, cleaning, cooking for the soldiers. And then there are other women who followed the soldiers to, I guess in Japan they call them comfort women, to have relationships, some kind of relationship with the soldiers. But there were all types of women who were there in the camp. And I include in the book a woman who was from Pennsylvania who was there with her husband and her son, both of whom had served in the Army and in the Continental Army. They were there at Gulph Mills. And then I think both her son and her husband left the Army sometime in Valley Forge, but she stayed on to work as a washerwoman and make money for the family. So, yeah.
On December 18th, 1777, Congress declared a day of Thanksgiving. What did that mean to them, and what was the reason for it?
Yes, the Day of Thanksgiving and Praise was something that the Continental Congress, they issued a proclamation on sometime in November to establish a national holiday, essentially, the first national holiday, really. Because many of the states, again, I said what General Gates did at Saratoga was amazing and a real lift to the Army, well, to the whole American Revolution. So many states were having different celebrations of the Battle of Saratoga. So the Continental Congress said, look, let's just have all these celebrations on one day. Let's just do one big celebration and kind of come together, because they had to build a new nation. This sense of we are one nation. We're not just 13 individual colonies or states. So that was the idea. And so the idea was all across the new United States, everyone would celebrate the victory at Saratoga, give thanks to God for that, and for basically keeping the revolution going, and prayer for the Continental Army. So Washington delayed the march to Valley Forge by one day. In his announcement on the 17th, he said, we're going to stay here in Gulph Mills on the 18th, and we're going to celebrate this National Thanksgiving Day. And so how that went was, he said, I have told every chaplain to preach a sermon about kind of, giving thanks and talk about what we're doing as a new nation. And then, it's not, they didn't have the food like we have today for Thanksgiving. Again, they had to eat what they could find, or some of the soldiers were able to eat with local residents who opened up their homes, as they did through the whole encampment, to, support the soldiers. And so Washington had a number of chaplains who delivered sermons. I have one in the book, actually a chaplain who his unit had served with General Gates at Saratoga. And so he preached about, okay, this was a great victory, but look, we also have a great man here in Washington. And he wanted his regiment to understand, I know you all have this honor for Gates, but have this honor for Washington. And so he talked about that. And he preached about strengthening them as they went into winter quarters, what they would endure, wherever they went couldn't be as bad as New England winters that they had already gone through. And so I also have some other sermons from preachers across the country who spoke that day. One in another New England country state who said, basically, he thanked the Virginians for all they did in basically being very active and sending so many troops and soldiers as part of the Continental Army. And again, George Washington, he was from Virginia, but they also said, we admire you for this, but can you please do something about your enslaved people? Can you free them too, as we're in this fight for freedom? So, yeah, so there were a lot of sermons, and then I include um, writings from some of the soldiers who says, look, okay, it was Thanksgiving, but what did we get? Some spoiled beef, or we could only get what we caught. Maybe we get a squirrel or we catch a turkey somewhere. So that's what that was all about. But it was important to have that national day to say, and for those troops to say, okay, remember still, this is a cause and we are united. And part of it, we're coming together. And now we're going into winter quarters and we're going to come out even better.
Well, let's talk about those winter quarters. After 6 days in Gulph Mills, Washington leads his troops to Valley Forge, of course, a very famous part of the American Revolution.
Yes.
Do we know why he selected Valley Forge?
We don't know exactly why, except again, it's about 8-10 miles maybe down the road from Gulph Mills, so it is further away from Philadelphia. Plus, it was populated. People were there, farmers, but there was certainly enough room for 11,000 people to comfortably, or relatively comfortably, build huts and hut themselves and sustain themselves for an extended period of time. And they were in Valley Forge for 6 months to the day from the time they marched in December 19th. But so we don't know exactly why Valley Forge, but of course, there was fresh water there. There was the Valley Creek. Excuse me. Gulph Mills still was a strategic outpost, was a picket. And there were several hundred soldiers there to guard Valley Forge, to serve as advance guard. So we don't know exactly why he selected Valley Forge, but in his orders of December 17th, when he explained why they were going into winter quarters and where, he felt that it was a strategic location as well. It wasn't, they were like a day's march away from Philadelphia. Like they could get there within a day if the British decided to do anything. And they could also protect the citizens of Pennsylvania from the British. So.
Now you mentioned the picket post that was kept in Gulph Mills. One of the
Yes.
officers who oversaw troops there was Aaron Burr, who's later famous
Yes.
for shooting Alexander Hamilton.
Yes.
How did he get along with the troops?
Well, he had to exert strict discipline. Let's just say that when that picket was set up early in the Gulph Mills, early in the Valley Forge encampment, it was apparently filled mostly with militia, Pennsylvania militiamen. And even the Pennsylvania Supreme Executive Council head, who was like the governor, Thomas Wharton, complained about the Pennsylvania militia not being the crack soldiers that they needed to be, not having the discipline that they needed to have. And he even said he wished that Pennsylvania could fill all of its ranks with regular Continental Army soldiers. So there were some issues as far as they were getting a lot of false alarms coming out of the Gulph Mills picket as to, the British, any movement, like, okay, I think the British are coming. And so then back at Valley Forge, they would have to rouse all the troops, and it turned out to be a false alarm. And I think some of the generals also felt like the soldiers at the picket were being a little lazy. Some were even going home without permission and coming back to the picket. So one general suggested, why don't you send Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Burr? He's very strict on discipline and he'll get that place straightened out. So they sent Aaron Burr down there, and Aaron Burr had a very famous encounter with some of his men because they didn't like his strict discipline and they were going to mutiny against him. And there was one ringleader. So Aaron Burr heard about it. Someone told him about it. He lined them all up one day and said something about, he heard there was, they were going to mutiny, or they were, getting ready to do something against him. And he said, well, the person who's going to do this, come on. So this soldier stepped out of line and he said, well, now's your chance, boys. And before anything could happen, Aaron Burr took his sword and kind of slashed the man's ear or hand or something, an arm, and left it hanging. And so then Aaron Burr just looked at him, told him, get back in line. And nobody else came out to test him or the others who were in command of that picket. So yes, but the picket was very important. It helped, served as some help to Lieutenant General Lafayette when he fought the Battle of Barren Hill in White Marsh in May, that the soldiers from the picket went to help him, and Washington himself. Some evidence, in the book that he was right there on Rebel Hill when Lafayette was in Barren Hill, because again, you could see across the Schuylkill, you could see what was going on, and was ready to call out the entire Continental Army if needed to support Lafayette. So it was a very important picket. But yes, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Burr did his duty. And the other thing, since you talk about Burr and Hamilton, I also include a letter where one of the local residents, again, they have to interact with these soldiers. He had a farm, and the soldiers in the picket were constantly taking his horses, or they were tearing down some of the rails in his fences. And he's like, look, they take out my horses for several days. They bring them back. The horses are tired. I can't get any farming done. So he wrote Washington and he said, can you please tell these soldiers to stop doing that? So at that point, at that time, Alexander Hamilton had made his way down from New York to Valley Forge, and he wrote the letter to the commander of the Gulph Mills picket at that time was, I think, Colonel Henry Jackson. He said, tell your men to stop taking this man's horses. And if I hear any more about it, you're going to be in trouble. So Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had their interactions with the Gulph Mills picket.
Well, we've been speaking with Sheilah Vance. She is the author of Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulph Mills Encampment. Sheilah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.